Hello, mentors. Welcome to our podcast series, Mentorships in Education, brought to you by Just Education at justeducationfirst.com. I am your host, Judith Epstein. I am very excited about the wide range of experts who have volunteered to give up their time and expertise. They will share their innovative ideas, their exciting perspectives, their rich resources, and their research with us. Please continue to delve into these topics on their websites and with your legal counsel, healthcare provider, and education professional. Our guests will have information that will be relevant to mentors supporting struggling students, parents, teachers, administrators, legal support, and health professionals. We will address all levels of education with issues that affect academic performance. Our goal is to open discussions and introduce a variety of approaches to those searching for information in a free venue. So mentors, let me introduce our guest for today.
Hello, mentors. Welcome to the podcast, Mentorships in Education. This is episode 23. It's brought to you by Just Education at justeducationfirst.com. I hope you will visit our website or look for us on other social media like YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts from. Thank you all for joining us today. We have a very special guest that I want to welcome, Dr. Richard Williams. Thank you so much for being with us today, Doctor. Before we get into a discussion, though, I want to tell our listeners a little bit about you. Dr. Williams has a PhD from the University of California at Berkeley. He has spent 20 years in the medical sciences in academia, doing research and teaching at the University of London, the Pasteur Institute in Paris, France, and the University of Karlsruhe, I hope I pronounced that correctly, in Germany. And he's also been with the World Health Organization in Africa, and I understand he lived in Africa for a little while. Perhaps he'll tell us a little bit about that. He's the author of 85 peer-reviewed research articles on molecular genetics and microbiology of infectious diseases. His interest in the world of autism started with his daughter, who he adopted in 1979 from Thailand at the age of 2, and we're going to talk a lot about his daughter Noi because it's so important. At no time has the autism spectrum disorders been considered until a small unaccredited college, Beacon College, was found in Florida. And Beacon College works specifically with students with learning disabilities, and they're the first ones who brought the possibility that Noi had autism to the attention of Dr. Williams and his wife. She did end up graduating with a BA in Human Services, which is rather exciting. I also want to mention Dr. Williams has a partner in his business that he works with, Jeffrey Freed, who has a clinical and counseling background on the subject of ASD and has published on the subject as well. It's a great blend of talents because while one is in the clinical end, Dr. Williams is in the research end. So they've made quite a team, and we can talk more about some of their interesting findings and the collaborative effort they brought together to help Noi develop as well as she has over the years. We have spent a great deal of time on this podcast talking about autism. We've talked about it from a child's perspective. We've heard from about a dad who's been raising children with autism, and we've spoken to a neuropsychologist about brain differences. We have also spoken with an accomplished adult who has been diagnosed with autism, and he told us about his journey into self-discovery. Today, our talk with a genetic researcher is going to help us delve into the genetic disorder of autism and share some fascinating discoveries that he and his partner have made in working with his daughter, Noi, over the years. So with that said, Dr. Williams, one of your contributions has been that you have a different perspective of autism than has been traditionally presented. In fact, you don't even call it ASD, you call it ASC. Maybe you can start by talking about that journey of yours and how the trajectory from your perspective is changing.
Thank you very much, Judith. It's a pleasure to be this, and thank you for the interview. We are on a topic that is rather dear to me and is special. I've spent the last 40 years studying in detail aspects of autism and have been able to bring to bear some of my own background in genetics to the topic. I'm not sure where we begin, but my interest clearly began with my daughter. We adopted her, as it was said, from Thailand at the age of 2. She had early on many of the characteristics that we now are able to identify, but we had no clue of during that period of time. She she was not looking at people in the eye. She had hypersensitivity to the hearing and a number of other characteristics that after the fact we were able to label and put into under the rubric of autism. That aspect of it has followed me through the years, and I've watched the development of our knowledge of autism, which is growing rapidly. And in particular, the recent genome studies that have brought to bear a lot of genetic information that we did not have 40 years ago. Indeed, we did not have it 15 years ago. Mm-hmm. So it has been a novel approach to studying the disease, and we can get into some of those details. But my personal interest is my daughter, and she has been on a remarkably positive success trail for her entire life. It's just a long delayed development, but she's right on course and is doing remarkably well.
Dr. Williams, you mentioned that 40 years ago some information was not available, and I know that, and I don't really understand the terms, but in reading a little bit about you, you have become a neurodiversity advocate. And I'd like you to explain what that means, and I would like you to explain why you refer to autism spectrum disorders as not a disorder, but ASC, as you call it, autism spectrum condition.
Be happy to. The term of neurodiversity developed in the 90s as an approach to teaching the population, teaching the public that we're dealing with a normal group of people for the most part, but with special conditions and special deficits, and that these are not a disease that is going to be solved by proper counseling or taking a pill or taking some sort of therapy. It's actually a lifetime condition, and it's not a malady. The entire genetic / professional, not genetic, but professional approach to autism has been an approach to treating and trying to remedy the deficits and the faults. What's been grossly missing has been identification of the assets of these people, and that there is a major intellectual loss by not identifying and nurturing those. The neurodiversity was put onto the map rather broadly and very, very focused by the tome that Steve Silberman wrote, Neurodiversity and the History of Autism. It is a bestseller and is categorically the authority of the history of autism. And he brought it to bear that identified that we now have in our creative businesses in Silicon Valley and our computer aspects of Silicon Valley, a very large number of people who are employed in the creative sciences or the creative businesses of Silicon Valley. Notably, Steve Jobs was autistic, and notably, Bill Gates was autistic. Those creative individuals have built an empire where creative arts and creative ideas have come from this population, and the genetic approach has confirmed the concept that it is a diversity based on genetics, and that means truly that is a condition that you can't change. You're not going to create a pill if you have a genetic condition, and that is better described then in a positive way by calling it autistic spectrum conditions.
It's interesting that you mention some of the individuals that have been that are associated with ASC, I will call it. I went onto your website, which I will say is allwaysautistic.com, allwaysautistic.com, and we will have that link on the website. But I was fascinated by the number of people that you have introduced on your website. Certainly you mentioned Bill Gates, but Steve Jobs and Emily Dickinson and Dan Aykroyd were some of the people that you mentioned. And I was really surprised because these are people that I consider to be so high functioning and so articulate that ASC would not be wouldn't even come into my mind as an association. So I think it's interesting that one of the quotes you have that I love and I think will fit in here is that you say, see the able, A-B-L-E, not the label, L-A-B-E-L, see the able, not the label. And that's kind of what you're talking about, is look for the strengths. Don't try and fix someone, but look at the strengths. Can you talk a little bit more about that aspect of working with individuals who have autism? You talk to me and you use the term the big picture versus the myopic view. Maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Well, the big picture that I approached the generalization with respect to all of the genetic studies that have been done has been to review all of the literature in detail and to understand the approaches of the genetic work that's been done, and especially most recently where we have the genome-wide association studies, or GWAS as they call it, that has allowed the identification of large numbers of genes that become associated with various conditions. And indeed, diseases, true diseases like diabetes and forms of cardiovascular disease are a polygenic genetic pool that it comes together that merely creates the propensity of acquiring the disease. And that means you can carry a large number of genes and certainly not have nothing to do with any sort of disease whatsoever. But those are true diseases where you can identify a metabolic condition, or you can identify a cholesterol condition in cardiovascular disease where you end up with a medical condition that does need to be repaired. On the other hand, the big picture has been to identify the polygenic, the multiple numbers of genes that indeed are related to autism, and to identify that there is an enormous gene pool of thousands of genes in all human beings, in everyone that does not have autism, as well as those that can carry them. And they accumulate over time and produce approximately 50%, accumulate through marriage. People like to identify people who have a similar intellectual ability or similar intellectual viewpoints, and they come together and associate in marriage and produce children who have an increased propensity of autism. As these gene pools are assembled through marriage, they acquire and accumulate, and you eventually reach a threshold where you have a autistic trait and eventually many traits giving diagnosis of autism. The other half of the causes of autism are de novo, which means that they don't occur in the genes that you carry. They occur after fertilization. And those, not all of them are environmental, but many of them have to do with large mutations, changes in the DNA structure early on in development that create the neuropathology of severe autistic conditions. Again, it's a condition, you can't change it, but because it occurs after fertilization, it's never passed on in the future generations. And then, of course, there is the environmental side, which is de novo. It happens on an occasional basis, but the influence is from the environment. And under those conditions, generally speaking, it arises as a major inflammatory response to infection during pregnancy. So if you have major inflammatory, if you're infected with the flu, for example, your body responds to fight the flu. And when that happens, it also creates the immune responses that fight the flu, but those are picked up also by the fetus. And during brain development, those conditions, those stimulators of the immune system alter normal development. And that is what we call the environmental input to it. Needless to say that the concept and the bogus approach of blaming vaccines is inappropriate. It is not scientific and has been refuted. It is not part of any aspect of autistic conditions.
You just stole my thunder. I was going to ask you about those vaccines. So that's great. I'm glad you addressed that. One of the things that we had mentioned when we were talking was that you felt that autism, the autism gene, had a connection or a close connection with intelligence. Can you address that a little bit?
Certainly. We know from history when the additional cases of autism were identified by Kanner, that one of his observations when he identified the first 5 cases of autism was very clearly that they came from highly educated and highly professional, successful families. Both parents displayed achievement and intellectual ability. So it's been around for a long time that there is some sort of association with intellectual ability and autism. But that has been clouded over recently, and we have today the stigma of autism, and that's the stigma that says that if you're autistic, you're dumb and you are mentally deficient, which is entirely erroneous. You do have mental deficiencies that are caused by genetic condition, by genetic changes, and those are severe cases of mental incapability or subnormal intelligence. Those cases that have that trait with less than optimal or less than normal intelligence are people who have suffered from large genetic changes after fertilization during development. Those are the conditions that give rise to modified intelligence. And what we see is that because it was one of the major identifying features in the clinical aspects, we find that people have walked away with the idea that autistic people have a deficit intellectually. But technically, it is quite the opposite. We have confirmed and identified through the new GWAS or the genome-wide studies the observations that Kanner made in his very first few patients. We now know that the genes, the large gene pool that carry the risk of autism as they accumulate, are also very similar, if not linked, to the large gene pool that creates intelligence. The two large gene pools are closely associated. And that means that the selection for intelligence will also select for autistic traits. And for the most part, those are not genetic deficits or genetic rearrangements that cause the stigma image of autism, or the intellectually compromised people that come out. The large gene pools are associated with intellectual ability and autism together. And that is now becoming more widely spread. We know there's a direct correlation, so that it appears that we are indeed looking at a group of people that have autistic traits, but they also carry those intelligence genes with them. And we can get into some of the abilities and why they've been in the genome for millions of years.
So if I can make a statement, and you can agree or disagree with me, but I think what you're saying is that there isn't a gene that we can single out that says, if we were to do a test, that this child is going to have autism. Is that correct?
Well, that is yes correct and no correct. What we know is that the large genetic mutations that occur after fertilization that we've referred to as producing autism and sometimes mental deficiencies, those are a select group of probably only 100 genes, if maybe 150 genes. Those have been identified, and they have been identified as being strongly modified genes. And those are all genes that are not carried into the next generation because it's not part of the sperm or egg. So yes, there are a group of genes, and some of those potentially in the future might be modifiable. But remember, you're dealing with a modified gene that has changed normal neurological development. So it might be too late if you were able to correct or fix one of those genes. But that group with those large modifications only give rise to 30% of the cases of autism. So it's not the majority by any means. It's a limited majority, or limited group, a minor group, and that gives them the traits of sometimes intellectual ability, but with severe autistic deficit traits as well.
So let me ask you about girls and boys who present with characteristics or the behaviors that we associate with autism, and this will kind of give us a segue into talking about NOI. But as from what I understand from some of the things you've written is that boys present very differently with characteristics of autism, where girls are very often overlooked with as a diagnosis for autism and are not determined to have autism until much later on in their development. Can you talk a little bit about why there's this discrepancy and why the diagnosis for autism is often lagging in girls?
I'd be happy to. We have in the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatry Diagnoses the listing of traits, basically a checklist that a physician or a psychiatrist or psychologist goes through to identify whether that a child has autism and can carry then the diagnosis of autism. If you look at those traits in that manual, it is very clear that those traits are the dominant traits of boys and men. It has little to do with the traits of women. They present very, very differently. So what we have is a large body of women who go through, these are more or less high functioning and ability to struggle and get through grammar school and get into the social pressure of high school and then into the real world where they may get into a work job and then finally marriage. The issue here is that the late diagnosis and indeed the misdiagnosis of autism in women and young girls is the major, largest, tragic story that autism brings to the world. We know that women suffer severely from autism and that it is not what you think autism is when you look at a boy or something like that. So we know that the CDC puts out a ratio of 4 boys to 1 girl. Now, if you look at the genetics of it, that doesn't make sense. Why is it all in boys and not all in girls or are equal? So the reality is the genetic argument would say it's much closer to 1 to 1. And indeed, if you look at the traits as they are expressed in girls and women and identify those, then those numbers come back down to well under 2 to 1, so that we have missed all of the girls for years. And where they get a diagnosis is tragically sometimes in their 30s or their 40s or their 50s after having lived a life knowing they are different, but not understanding why and struggling with issues to get along. Girls are in early development very more advanced socially than boys, and they learn quickly from their peers and from other girls how to behave in an earlier age than boys do. That's a well-known recognized trait. But what the autistic girl does is she camouflages her internal feelings, her internal approach to the world, and she uses the same words, the behavior, and the traits of the neurotypical girls her age, so that she copies them and she masks their behavior so that they go through grammar school and high school having camouflaged their real underlying autism. And when it gets so skilled, at the time mom and dad say there's something wrong, I don't know what it is, you go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, she looks at people in the eye, she can socially talk very coherently and very positively, she's not suffering from grades in school, she clearly can't be autistic. And that comes from a misdiagnosis, and from there, frequently they diagnose the traits that result from anxiety that these women carry. And that anxiety produces itself in the form of depression, and indeed a very, very common diagnosis for women and girls in high school is anorexia nervosa or bulimia. Those are all dominant diagnoses of women in young adulthood as well, so that those are actually responses to the depression and the anxiety of living a camouflaged life. So that if you're good at it, and some of the very intelligent women become skilled at it, they can sometimes not identify that they are different, but they have this urge and this feeling inside of immense anxiety, and they live with that for a long time until somebody comes along at age 35 and says, you were misdiagnosed as a child, you have lived with autism for 35 years. And you end up with 2 responses, one of immense, my God, I understand it now. And the other response is, I didn't know that, that scares me, and I won't tell anybody. but most of the time it's a major relief for people saying, now I understand who I am. Now I understand why I have always felt the way I have felt. That is the prime example of late diagnosis and a major loss of normal life for late diagnoses of autism in women. It's a crime, it's a shame. We need to have better trained professionals who are skilled at not the diagnostic manual for psychiatry and mental illnesses, but somebody who understands autism and can identify that at an early age and in high school and early adulthood for women.
So let me talk a little bit about your daughter, Noi, because she is an example of misdiagnosis for many years. And I'm curious with the list of behaviors that you outlined, that some girls present with: the anxiety, the depression, the eating disorders. These are certainly problems girls have that would not be diagnosed with autism. So how was it determined that your daughter, I'm assuming as an older teenager, maybe would be diagnosed with autism? What was the aha moment, if you will, that these professionals decided that she was autistic?
Well, it's a complicated story because when we were living in Africa, it was very clear that there were significant developmental delays. She did not walk until she was 2.5. She did not talk until she was 4, yet understood the environment around her and knew what was going on. Those today we would identify with a significant problem and get psychiatric help and likely have a diagnosis of autism. But that wasn't the case in the 1980s. And we ended up eventually from Africa going to the University of London, where I had taught medicine before. And we spoke to a psychologist there who gave us the clue that she might have Asperger's. Now, I hadn't heard of Asperger's before, so that started my quest. And from that day forward, I made it my business to understand autism. So at that time, knowing that she had autistic traits really didn't help anything at all. We were able to accommodate her lifestyle and her conditions. She eventually learned to speak when the kindergarten teacher, the first grade teacher said, she's very intelligent. She's very, very clearly aware of everything around her. She doesn't talk, but it's time for her to read. So she sat down one-on-one, an hour or two a day, broken up, and they went through an elementary book where she pointed out the words on the page and gave the words on the page a name. This is the book. And from the day that started, her language returned, and she was speaking at the end of 3 to 5 months of teaching her to read. That again would have been a major element of diagnosing autism, but we missed that. We didn't know what it was, but we finally we've accommodated to the issues that she had, including eating and a few of the other things. We were able to live and accommodate with those. And in the 90s, it became very clear from my research, this is obviously autism, and we know now much more than we do in the 90s, but she was able then to go to this university, college in Florida, Beacon College, and there they taught the students how they learn. So each and every student has his own learning style, which is not what we do today in providing instruction for classrooms. We don't identify the method that they learn. We indeed take the knowledge that they have to have, and we give it to them in a structured format. That doesn't work for autistic people. And you find learning disabilities come out spread all over the case. We knew that Noi had learning disabilities, and we went to this college because they offer education where the learning styles are identified, and all the teaching is teaching to that methodology of them learning. So with that and the knowledge that I was gaining, it was very clear from my perspective that it was autism, and I didn't really need a diagnosis because that isn't going to provide a lot. What it requires is identifying how to make her world work in the middle of a neurotypical world, and that is sort of teaching accommodation, teaching her what you should do here and what you should do there. And from that, it's become very successful. But it's a game of, I don't know how many parents are enlightened by the energy that I've put into the science and the medical side of autism, but it's very clear that you do have some remarkable historical people. In the 60s, there was a gentleman, it's funny, it slipped my mind, who was a psychologist for the Navy and identified autism and the traits very early in 1965, made a very, very major contribution, but it was a single piece of work standing out there, not from a research institution, but from a psychology person producing the material. That was a seminal publication that today people reference and go back to. I apologize, I don't have the name, but it begins with an R, and it is a major historical element in autism studies. But from there, now we have studies for women, and indeed, studies for women have unfortunately left many out. One of the issues in modern research is they set up a nice, large clinical study for studying autism, and in that clinical study, they say we're going to have 500 girls and we're going to have 500 women, boys, so age matched, intelligence matched, etc. And they recruit the boys for the study, and then they go look for the girls, or at the same time they can't find them. They're not there. So much of the research that occurs on a diminished number of women or girls in the studies. So for 500 boys, they may have 25 girls that have been age matched and intelligence matched. Well, that's statistically irrelevant when you're looking at a large group. So because of diagnosis issues, the research on women hasn't been there. We need to have more research on women, but that requires diagnosis. And the majority of recruiting women is that there are not a lot of them at the earlier ages because they're not diagnosed. So that those research studies have failed women in that respect, not intentionally by any means. Indeed, they recruit as many as they can find, but that population is inherently small because of failure of diagnosis.
Doctor, when we get off of the recording, why don't you check on the name of that person that you were referring to who did that research and get that link and send it to me, and we will include it on the podcast so people can go and look it up if they would like to. I also want to mention that I listened to Mr. Freed's video that is on your website on right brain versus left brain and thinking in pictures, and you were referring to students who have the diagnosis of autism and how they learn. And it's a very interesting video. It's short, and I would definitely recommend it to parents or teachers to look at that. Would you like to spend a minute and talk a little bit to the parents, perhaps, as to some of the challenges other than medical challenges that you addressed, some of the perhaps everyday issues that you needed to work out with you and your wife, with Noi, and how you were able to support her? There may be some tidbits of information that you could share that would be helpful to parents who are going through this now?
I'd be happy to. There are a number of autistic traits that need to be considered in an educational point of view, but that are also highly important on the moment-to-moment lifestyle and moment-to-moment living of a person on the autistic spectrum. And for a child with autism, you need to recognize several traits that are very significant. The biggest and most predominant one is by far hypersensitivities and indeed hyposensitivities. These are sensory changes and that are inherent to nearly all cases of autism, well over 95, 98%. So that at some level, you will likely have a sensory issue with your child. That might be hyperhearing, that might be visual, that might be indeed tactile, where they only want to wear a certain type of clothing and choose to not put on restrictive clothing. So it's a tactile sense. All of the senses can be impinged or can be involved. So that what you need to do and to think about when you see behavior that is resistant and or severely outbursting, there is an explanation for it, and it's likely a simple explanation. It's an overload of some aspect of their environment, whether it's the large noise and the large groups of people, or whether it is wearing the wrong clothing and having the wrong texture food that is they're asked to live with or work with or eat. So, you need to consider that for most all behavior in the home that seems abnormal or a problem with autistic children, there's a reason for it. And one of the best things you can do is to sort of search through why is that there. Many times it's simple overload from frustration. And that can easily be frustration for not communicating what he wants to say or what she feels like she needs to say. So that those built-up frustrations are inherent where you're living with overload of sensory input or environmental input. And I would encourage you to investigate the sensitivities of autism. And indeed, for example, one of the best ones is fluorescent lighting. If a child with autism has visual sensitivities, they will hate and will resist and will have a terrible time using lighting from a fluorescent light bulb. Because visually, it is clear light to most people, and it comes down like incandescent light. But in fact, the lights turn off and turn on 60 times every second. People with visual sensitivity see that light go on and see it go off. And it's like having a strobe light in your face, where a child, anybody would react from an absolute overload of sensory input if a strobe was going on and off once every second or once every half second, and we would respond negatively. And the first thing we would do would be to avoid it. So what you'll see is much of the behavior is in early autism is an attempt to get rid of what is frustrating. And that means in the worst case, just tuning out, where they go silent and they stop taking information in from the outside, and they appear to be dumb or at least in a dream, but they're not communicating with their environment. That's when it gets to be extreme. Otherwise, you'll have frustrating outbursts. And with girls, girls will not outburst almost at all. They rather internalize the frustration. They internalize the stress. And that's what results in the depression, and that's what results in anxiety. So you see these different responses, but the easiest one is the clear environmental stress from hypersensitivities of the environment, and that means too much activity and whatever else. And you find very simply a lot of routine that they would like to have or demand frequently in their behavior is an attempt to reduce the chaos that they have from overload of sensing. And that is if you recognize that, then you're not going to say, why are you lining up all those toys all the time? Or why are you playing so aggressively with the dolls and repeating the same words again and again and again? Those are stress reactions to an overloaded environment from their autistic environment of hypersensitive feelings. And therefore, I think there's a lot if you recognize the behavior in your child and that search for an explanation of the difficult times that you have. And it is possible that a lot of those can be ameliorated by altering some aspect of your environment.
That's wonderful information, and I'm sure there are many parents who are struggling with trying to understand some of the outbursts that they're experiencing in their homes and what the trigger is. And a lot of these children can't tell you what the problem is, and so your suggestions, I think, will go a long way into their trying to do some due diligence and seeing if there's any continuity to these outbursts and maybe some of the things you suggested as they appear. You've talked a little bit about, to me anyway, about a book that you've written on autism. And is that book out yet? Is there a title? Where can people get it?
It is a book, and it is in its assembly. We have several chapters written, and I've done a blog on the genetics on my website, and we have more to come as well. In particular, my partner has done hypersensitivities in a webcast or in a video form, and we're basically are covering the obvious traits that when one reads it, you can read the sensitivities chapter and understand precisely how one responds if they have hypersensitive hearing or hypersensitive touch or feel, a tactile. And that gives you an explanation of what they feel and understand. That's the nature of the book. We're talking about supporting autism, and the book title is Supporting Autism, Especially Women, because what I have as a goal here is to identify and to project so that the public understands the tragedy of the medical lack of diagnosis for women and indeed misdiagnosis. I think there's a lot to learn, and in medical schools and in teaching schools and in psychology schools, you need to understand what the presentation is for women in order to eliminate this late diagnosis problem and ameliorate things. That's a major piece of the book at this time. We will probably publish it at the end of the year.
Dr. Williams, thank you so much for being with us today. I want to mention some other things on your website that the link for your website will be with the podcast. I noticed there is a section on the website where you make suggestions for books for kids to read as well as parents, novels as well as nonfiction that relate to autism. There are TV shows that you suggest that parents and children can watch, and movies that are based on characters who have autism. So I think your website has a tremendous amount of information, certainly for parents and teachers or any mentors that want to begin to understand what that world is like. We're going to have that website on the podcast. You have told me that people can contact you through Twitter and Facebook, LinkedIn and Instagram, and all of those links will be on the podcast. thank you again so much for being with us. This was a challenge with the connection that we've had. People don't know that we're doing signs to each other because there's so much of a delay here, but thank you so much for being with me, and I want to thank our mentors for joining us today. I hope you will continue to send in your questions and guest recommendations. I hope you will all stay safe, be well, and stay connected with each other and with us. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, mentors, for being with us today. If you found this podcast of value, please visit justeducationfirst.com to subscribe to our blog and Mentorship and Education podcast so that you may continue the exploration with us. Our goal is to provide a free treasury of information for our listeners so they can become acquainted with the amazing resources that we have available to us. We want to thank all of our guests for giving their time and sharing their wealth of information with us. Please also visit their websites and explore more of their resources to further your pursuit of the topic. Hope to hear from you at justeducationfirst.com. Have a good week, and thank you.